I wouldn't say I was a great teacher. I think I was pretty solid as a young teacher and maturing at the time that I left the classroom. But I know a lot of great teachers, and many of them, I'm proud to say, work for us in the HRCE. When I look back at what I was doing versus what they're doing, I didn't and couldn't hold a candle to them. But the underpinning of successful leadership and successful teaching is the same, and it's relationships.
Yeah.
And in the same way that the best lesson plan in the world will fail with a class of kids who aren't connected to their teacher, and the worst lesson plan in the world will still succeed if a teacher and a class of children have a great positive relationship and close connection. Leadership is the same. You've got to build those connections and relationships with people that you work with. You have to build trust, and that's a two-way street, and it takes time. But the aptitude to relationship building and the focus on it is pivotal in both contexts. Beyond that, it does become different skill sets. I think it's essential that you've been at least a good teacher. I don't think a poor teacher could be a good leader in an education system, but I don't think you need to have been a great teacher. And in fact, I'd like the great teachers to stay in the classroom because that's where the greatest impact is.
So today we head back to the East Coast to Nova Scotia to talk with Steve Gallagher, Regional Executive Director of Halifax Regional Center for Education. That's a mouthful. And I'd not known Steve before. However, having worked in the Halifax School Board before the name change and the restructuring, was working there while Steve was also leading at the time, but our paths did not cross. But we have a lot of things in common. I'm very familiar with the place and space in which he's working. And the question that we begin with, that you just heard a little teaser of, is one that I think about a lot. And I think about it in the context of sports as well. Do great players necessarily make great coaches? And if you look, there are not very many good examples of excellent players who become excellent coaches. So right now, if you're thinking, you're not, I don't think you're coming up with many names, which beg that question, right? Do you need to be a great teacher to be a great leader? And Steve has some really interesting takes on that. I think he's spot on in his perspective. And in leadership, especially school leadership, this trajectory that we've had of going from teacher to principal to district person to superintendent, director, CEO is pretty common everywhere you go. And hearing Steve's take on that is, I think, refreshing. And I think he shares a lot of really good things. And was just one of these people who we just connected right away and had lots to talk about. And there were more questions that I had that we just didn't get to. So it was a pretty fast paced thing, lots of really exciting conversations. And it is great to add somebody like Steve to my network of great leaders across Canada. So I hope you enjoy today's conversation with Steve Gallagher. All right, Steve, the first question is, or not a question, but comment, but I think you hold the record for the largest office of a CEO superintendent, which I know you're a bit bashful to share.
Yeah, I'm really proud to hold the record, and that's something I've been working toward for a long time, and I finally achieved it. I think it's bigger than most lunchrooms.
Yeah, and listen, like when we talked earlier, I've been in your building before, and it's in a beautiful place. And let me see if it's in Dartmouth, right?
That's right. Yeah.
And I want people to know that I pronounce that correctly, right? Like when I first came, I would say Dartmouth, and then people would
Dartmouth.
very quickly say it's Dartmouth.
Yeah.
You got to go quick there. So anyway, I feel like I
You're
have a connection to that space, and I know you've talked about just being able to go outside and get a quick walk in the woods right there, which is always a good thing. So yeah, beautiful spot. But listen, you come to this position having been in the region for quite some time. And this was the conversation that you and I wrestled with the other day. And I think it's a fascinating one. So you had a relatively short tenure as a classroom teacher before you got on the leadership train, if you will. Maybe just give us some context about what that looked like and what led you into leadership as quickly as it did for you.
Yeah. When I look back, it is a bit of a shock to me, but of course, at the time, you don't see the pattern. When you're living it, you don't see it unfold. But I was a high school teacher, social studies, ancient history is my background. And right out of the gate, I was quite lucky to get a position in teaching in social studies and did 3 years full time. And then there were some circumstances here around about 1990, 1999, government looking at cutbacks, that sort of thing. And a lot of us young teachers were given temporary pink slips. Most were hired back. I think almost all of us were hired back, actually. But I took an opportunity at that time to go looking elsewhere. And I ended up working for a company for a year. And the company was in Chicago, and I was writing curriculum for them at the height of the .com boom and the idea of moving education online. I was very interested in that and the technology of the time, which today I think is antiquated, but at the time it was very exciting. So I did that for a year. The .com boom went bust, and I found myself back in the classroom, back in my old classroom after a year. And so at that time, I had an opportunity to move into a department head job. So for 3 years, I was the head of the social studies department at Wellesley High School in Spryfield, community just outside downtown Halifax. And 3 years on, I did some leadership training and became a vice principal. And then vice principal for 7 years. And then became principal, and I was principal and then I moved here to central office and became a senior staff advisor, which is essentially the deputy CEO. So the path is unusual and I think in some respects quite quick. I am happy to point to the fact that I've had the opportunity to be both a vice principal and a principal at every grade level in our system, which I think has served me well in lots of different conversations and contexts.
And which kind of brings up this interesting idea that education is, I don't know of another institution, profession where the expectation is that you start as a teacher and you move to the
Mhm.
highest level of leadership. That is not true maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just not thinking, but I don't see that. In fact, I was having a conversation with my colleagues the other day around coaches in sports and how few excellent players become excellent
Mhm.
coaches. There's not that many. And yet there's the idea that, oh, you were a master teacher and therefore you became a leader and now you're mastering the art of leadership. And I'd love to hear your thoughts around the degree to which that's true, that's false, that
Right.
people should understand it's not this, because I don't think it's the same job. But yes, there are always elements of every job around relationship building and so forth that is universal. But I wonder how connected the teacher to the leader role you're in now is.
I would say there isn't a great deal of connection in this moment between the current role I have and the classroom teacher. But I think the strategy to address that is to stay in regular communication. And one of the themes that underpins my work this year is listening to lead. And I spend a lot of time connecting with staff to make sure that I'm hearing exactly what's happening in the classroom, in the school, and beyond. What's that notion that all of us are smarter than some of us? There's a lot of value in that. But to go back to your point, it's a very interesting topic. First of all, I wouldn't say I was a great teacher. I think I was pretty solid as a young teacher and maturing at the time that I left the classroom. But I know a lot of great teachers, and many of them, I'm proud to say, work for us in the HRCE. I when I look back at what I was doing versus what they're doing, I didn't and couldn't hold a candle to them. But the underpinning of successful leadership and successful teaching is the same, and it's relationships.
Yeah.
And in the same way that the best lesson plan in the world will fail with a class of kids who aren't connected to their teacher, and the worst lesson plan in the world will still succeed if a teacher and a class of children have a great positive relationship and close connection. Leadership is the same. You've got to build those connections and relationships with people that you work with. You have to build trust, and that's a two-way street and it takes time. But the aptitude to relationship building and the focus on it is pivotal in both contexts.
Yeah.
Beyond that, it does become different skill sets. And I think I think it's essential that you've been at least a good teacher. I don't think a poor teacher could be a good leader in an education system, but I don't think you need to have been a great teacher. And in fact, I'd like the great teachers to stay in the classroom because that's where the greatest impact is. So,
And I think too, again, it comes down to credibility, right? If you've never been in a classroom and you're speaking about something in a classroom, who are you to? So I think that's one of the elements where it's necessary for you to do that. You're not telling people what to do, but when you're making decisions about what happens in the classroom, having that credibility is there. So a couple of the questions I want to, and I'm trying to tie in with some of my previous interviews. A previous one, a colleague of yours, Jared Purdy, who I think you're pretty close with in terms of your
Yes,
professional
indeed.
career and personal. You also admitted, and I'll say this out loud, that he's a far better hockey player than you are. Although
Yes,
you're
that's
still
true.
playing hockey. You wanted to make that clear.
Yes.
You're still on the active roster.
Yeah, let's be clear. High level hockey, solid house right here. It's
You're
the
right.
guy. I'm
Right.
house league. Yeah.
I'm just curious, how often do you play?
Friday nights for 90
Okay.
minutes.
Always Friday nights. Good. That's a good way to end the
Yeah.
week.
Heart attack hockey.
Right. But you and Jared, who are technically in the same role, you're both, and I want to get this right. Executive regional directors.
Regional executive director.
Regional executive directors.
Red.
Okay.
Red for sure.
Red. But Jared serves a community, Tri-County, which is, I don't know, about 10 times smaller or ish than, maybe even smaller than Halifax. And so just this notion of your day to day versus Jared's day to day, how would you, again, I don't want you can't speak for what he does in his daily work. That wouldn't be
Right.
fair, but you have a sense of, just in your conversations. I know now as a province, you're probably working more closely with other regional executive directors. How is what you do different than Jared, to whatever degree you can get specific? Because I don't think you do that. I don't think your
Sure.
day to days look the same, probably.
In some respects, they're quite different, but in others, I think they're very similar. And I guess the starting point is, yeah, I'll acknowledge, I think 10 times is a good metric. He has about 6,000 students. We have 60. He has in the neighborhood of 20 plus schools. We have 137 today. So it's certainly on the surface, it would look like we're worlds apart. But the province of Nova Scotia is focused on alignment among our 8 different regions, 7 regions, and CSAP, our French board. And we work together very closely. And so the 8 of us are in communication. I wouldn't say daily, but very frequently. And we meet 2.5 days every month together to work on things. And our policy, our language, our priorities are very much the same. And so when we come together, there's a common language that we're able to speak. But the scale does mean that there's a difference. And I think I have an awful lot more things happening at any given time, but I also have a great and much larger team than he has to address those issues.
Right.
His day to day is different. There's no question than mine. He's likely actioning things and I'm likely giving direction for action to happen. But if you get to the content is the same, the
Right.
priorities are the same, and our areas of focus are the same.
But I think the other differentiating factor, and again, maybe it's scale, but it's pretty real for you. And you talked about just the growth conversation that you have to have, paying attention to that, which is not something that every district across Canada has to deal with.
Right.
But you've had the most, probably, arguably, Nova Scotia in general, Halifax specifically, probably the most growth population over the last 4 years, a little bit pre-COVID, but certainly COVID. So how does that kind of, just the growth piece in
Mhm.
terms of like your day-to-day work?
Yeah, that would be the area that is of greatest difference, I think, between myself and the other regions. Nova Scotia is growing and has been for a number of years, but more than 80% of that growth is concentrated in the HRM. So it is our kind of our day to day work. And we're thinking about how we support the students who are arriving. And many of those students are new to the country, which is a relatively new experience for Nova Scotia. So developing the right back end to support families, we're still in the process of doing that. Another stream of growth within that big enrollment explosion is students with special needs, and supporting them is another big area of focus. More broadly, we work closely with government around the idea of where are we going to fit all of these kids? And facilities management is a big piece of this in a way it's never been before. Nova Scotia historically is all about, we used to call it going down the road, where on the East Coast, people left and our population was declining and people went west to find work. And in the
Right.
last 10 years, and really specifically the last 5 years, that trend has completely reversed. And so we know how to get smaller. We're still working out how to get bigger and so there's lots of rough edges to work through and work at the epicenter of that. And so we've added 5 schools in the last 5 years. We've got 7 currently under construction. We've added 141 modular units in the last 5 years. We've reconfigured 50, that's 50 schools in the last 5 years, meaning moving grade levels between schools to fit kids in. And our growth is up over 8,000 kids in the last 5 years, with projections that go like this for the next
Right.
10 to 15.
Wow.
So I am spending a lot of time with our planning team trying to map out just facilities where our folks are going to be working, and where our kids are going to be learning, and making sure that those spaces are warm and welcoming, and set up for a positive student experience.
I was having dinner a couple weeks ago with a group of superintendents in British Columbia, and I asked them how much of their time is spent dealing with their board, like the fact that they
Mhm.
have to kind of navigate that. And to a person, they said anywhere from 70 to 80% of their time is like maybe not directly, but indirectly, that's who their boss
Right.
is their school board. You, unlike Jared, didn't have the experience of working as in his role prior to the changes in Nova Scotia where school boards have been dissolved. You do have the experience of leading in high level leadership before and after. So when I say that to you, that these people are spending 80% of their time dealing with school boards, tell me about what that makes you think about in terms of, again, looking back and now in terms of
Yeah.
how that's changed your role.
Yeah. In the job I had before this as senior staff advisor, one of my main areas of focus was supporting the elected board. And I'm not surprised to hear that it's that much time. I think, particularly in high functioning boards, people are deeply invested in the work, and somebody needs to help them navigate the ins and outs of education, and help them acquire wisdom enough to form good opinions, and give good direction to the executive who's running the system. That piece of it has evaporated for us in some respects, but it's been replaced by other work in
Right.
other ways. Our So in the past, the chief tech for families, the public, and so on were elected board members around education issues. Today in Nova Scotia, it's our MLAs, and I have regular conversations with MLAs. I had a text from an MLA last night around midnight about a concern. We were back and forth before 7 a.m. this morning, and that's MLAs have replaced elected board members in terms of those issues, but their frame and their scope is different, because an elected board member is exclusively focused on education, and an MLA is a whole host of other issues that they're concerned about. So they don't necessarily have the time to spend to dig into an issue with me and wrestle with what might have caused a decision. So the conversations are different. But I have to say they're very good. They're very good. I'm really lucky that the MLAs I work closely with here in the city, and there's I don't know what the number might be, 12 or 15, really great to work with. And they also bring a broader understanding of how government works, how it won't work. And so sometimes conversations and issues, there's a shorthand to it that wouldn't necessarily be in place with folks who are coming to be elected to a governing board in a school system. They're might be their first experience with it, or they're very focused on a particular issue in education. And MLAs are the ultimate generalists. And so they have a broader perspective to share, and they work within. So it's hard to compare it. It's apples to oranges in some respects. I often get asked by colleagues across the country, which is better. And I can't say with confidence which is better. Our current system has a lot of detractors, and families will say a level of democracy has disappeared and there's not enough voice for families. I respect that perspective, certainly. Um, but the MLAs do a very good job of getting involved in issues and working to get them to successful conclusion.
Well, and that's interesting, Steve. I had not thought about the role of the MLAs in the education space. I think that's fascinating. And I'd also just add to that, based on my conversation with Jared, that all of you are working towards bringing parents into the conversation with
Yes. Yeah.
advisories and things of that nature, so that you're not trying to eliminate their voice. It's just a different structure. And I know the end goal is that this is going to be better for students and relatively early in this transition. So there's still lots of things
Yeah.
to work out
A hundred.
and get right.
Yeah. 100%. I think that government's done a good job of responding to the feedback that parents are feeling that their families are involved enough. And a high functioning education system has parents as equal partners in the
Right.
process. They have to be. And so in this last 6, 8 months, we're moving into a phase where we're trying to invite more open conversation to address that concern. And I'm pretty confident we're going to get there in the next year or two. We're
Yeah.
organizing public meetings and establishing a couple of different regional councils for each of the RCEs. It's a process and we're moving along the road and we're getting better as we go. What I will say about the elimination of the school boards, all but one, of course, the French board remains, is it's made possible the kind of alignment we have in the province right now. And on the old version of things, elected boards set their priorities, and there was a fair bit of, I'll say, drift, generously, among boards around priorities. And other than getting your budget from the government, there wasn't a lot of checks and balances, and there wasn't a lot of kind of coming together to create a shared vision. And we're able to do that very organically, very easily. And because of the way that we work now and how frequently we meet, and we meet with the deputy minister, who's the person that we report to, the REDs report to, we're really united as a province when it comes to education in a
Yeah.
way that we weren't before. And that's
Yeah.
really exciting.
This episode is brought to you by Advanced Learning Partnerships, also known as ALP. We are a professional learning consulting group that serves communities across North America. We are partners, designers, and agents for change. You can learn more about the work we do at alplearn.com. And now back to the show. Part of what this shift was all about is to create that better alignment that doesn't matter if a kid's in Cape Breton or Halifax, that you're all working towards the same thing. And I think many people might argue that shouldn't matter if they're in Halifax or in Edmonton or
Yeah.
Regina or whatever. At the end of the day, I think my experience has been that provinces love to hang their hat on whether it comes to teacher certification or whatever, that there's a lot of barriers because everybody's a bit territorial with it, which, okay, fine. But reality is like learning is learning and kids are kids. And I think we can all design the big parameters. And yet everybody wants a degree of autonomy and localization to say, hey, here's how our community, even if it's in and now I think even when we talk about diversity is now true across Canada. It used to be in urban centers had,
Right.
populations. Now it's like, no, even in Jared's little county in Tri County, you got people of every race and orientation and whatever other way you want to phrase that. So diversity is everywhere. And so that can't just be an urban issue. But let me dive deep into the localization. When you think about
Sure.
Halifax region, what are you most proud of?
Oh, what an interesting question. I'm most proud of the team here, and I'm a lifer, 27 years with the HRCE, previously HR, and I'm incredibly proud of the people I've had the privilege of working with and the people I see every day going over and above and just hitting it out of the park for kids. And it's important to say, I see that with every one of our teams. And if we're talking about our business units, I just can't speak enough about what happens on our operations team, how committed our folks are. When I go down into HR and I see the work that the HR managers are doing or our payroll clerks, the people here are the people. That's the thing I'm most proud of.
Yeah.
And I think teachers get a lot of the spotlight and credit, and rightly so, no question about it. And I would put our teachers up against anybody across this country in terms of performance. Our school leaders get an awful lot of praise and they deserve it. But it's important to say at the outset that the people who work at the back of the shop are just as high performing and do some incredible things to make the people at the front of the house able to do their work. The people here are that's what I'm most proud of. And I'm also proud of the journey we've been on in the last 5 years, which has really changed our system quite dramatically. And it probably aligns to a lot of what Jared said. Dean, I was irritated that you spoke to him first because he got all the good talking points. But I will tell you that this story of instructional leadership and change in the last 5 years in Halifax is an incredible one. And I'm so proud of it. And in my previous role, had the privilege of being in as an architect of that. And now as the RED, I feel as though I'm the beneficiary of it. And I'm excited to see where we go next with it. I can tell you quickly what that story is if you'd like.
Sure.
Yes, that's it. Sure.
Yeah.
If we go back about 10 years, what emerged here was a substitute shortage. And we've not really recovered from it. And setting aside the challenges on the impact on our teachers and our leaders day to day in schools, one of the things that it did was it stopped us being able to offer large scale professional development. And as we focused on where are we going to move our system, how are we going to move our system, and where are we going, the traditional way of doing that was disrupted. And at the same time, my predecessor, Ellen LaRue, who's now the deputy minister, and I started talking about first voice and hearing more from a large and growing system. And so we organized a group of principals together we called the APP, the Advisory Panel of Principals. And still running, I meet with them regularly multiple times through the year, but we started to ask questions about how can we move forward. And we heard two major themes over the course of a year and a half. And the first was reorganize and move decision making closer to the classroom. That's a profound thing in a system our size, but it was an important one. And the second thing was our leaders wanted to be instructional leaders. And across our system, we had some diamonds out there that were real instructional leaders, but there were lots of people like myself who were pretty good site managers. In that old saw of if nobody calls the school board, you're a good leader. There was lots of that in the system. And that was me, to be clear, in my role both as vice principal and principal. Our principals and vice principals participating in the AMP were talking about they wanted to be the instructional leaders. And so those two ideas became our North Stars over the next couple of years. Let us focus deeply on our principals and vice principals and get them to a level of instructional leadership where they can in turn lead their staff, because we couldn't bring teachers out of classrooms at a scale large enough to have an impact.
Right.
And we needed to do something around getting the decisions closer to the classroom. So in here centrally, we had two very big departments. One was called school admin and one was called program. And school admin ran the business of school, and that's who principals reported to. And program was about instructional practice and what was happening in the classrooms. And we had a host of things we called hallway issues, because here in the building, on one side of the hallway is school admin and on the other was program. So what principals were saying was decisions were made over here, but they weren't connecting over here. And so the idea we needed to challenge was, and wrestle to the ground, was how we integrate these two and how we create a decision-making process that's much closer to the principal and classroom. And so we did. We reorganized those two departments, and it was the first time change that happened in 15 years, and created two program departments, an elementary program department and a secondary program department. And then we reorganized the way that principals met. So principals met traditionally in that family of schools model. And lots of systems, I think, still do this. You get the high school principal, the junior high principals, or the middle school principals, and the elementary school principals, and they're a unit, and they meet together. The problem with that is that the high school principal doesn't have anybody to talk to. They can talk about the community, but they can't talk about the similarities and challenges of learning. And you get to the middle level and there might be one or two. And at the elementary level, there might be three or four or five, but there could be real differences between the schools. So we reorganized our schools into what we call SLCs, or school learning communities. And basically, we put schools together that have common issues, common challenges, common frameworks. And so it's no longer the high school principal and the elementary principal trying to make a connection about instructional leadership. Now it's the high school principals are talking about their challenges. It might be an elementary principal from here in Dartmouth connecting with someone out in St. Margaret's Bay. We're a big system, and ordinarily they wouldn't have had a real conversation. Today in those SLC groupings, they're connecting every single week to talk about instructional leadership. We reorganize centrally. We reorganize how our schools are grouped together and how our principals connect. And it changed everything. And we've gone to a place now where our principals are instructional leaders. And I'm in schools every Wednesday, one of the great privileges of the job. And if I think about 5 years ago when I visited a school and had a conversation with a principal, great people doing great work, but they couldn't tell me with any kind of specificity what was happening in their classrooms. Today, when I go into any one of our schools, I know that the principals, to a person, know who in their school isn't successful yet, and they can tell me what they're doing about it, which is just incredible. And they're speaking in the language of instructional leadership. They're talking about teaching strategies and accessing coaching and being strategic about what they're going to do. And I know Jared probably talked to you about this, but our whole system is focused on a short cycle now, where we are checking in on our students every 6 to 8 weeks. And for those who aren't successful yet, we're putting a plan in place and checking in again, and then putting another plan in place. Maybe we're refining it, maybe we're throwing it out. But broadly, our principals have transitioned from being facilities managers to true instructional leaders, and they're walking the walk every day in schools. And that journey. So if I say, wow, this is a long-winded answer. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
If I say, what am I most proud of? I'm most proud of the people I work with. Absolutely. The thing that comes next is a journey that we've been on and where we are today versus where we were 5 and 10 years ago. And I'm really excited to see where we go next.
Each of those pieces or elements that you shared about what you're proud of could be their own sort of separate in-depth conversation. I think it's really fascinating. So you and I may have to continue this, those pieces another time, because I think there's a lot of richness there. But again, my takeaway is the intentionality by which you've structured things, right? There's a thought for it. And we don't just, people often, I've heard the joke about you just put a building down, and how do you decide who goes to school? It's just kids in the area. Like that, there's no rhyme or
Yes.
reason. You have the luxury or the intention of saying it, that doesn't have to be that way. That doesn't make sense. We can put people together that need to be put together with the intention of building some of those abilities to support educators. And I was going to, and maybe real quickly, just because I've got a few other questions, and I don't want this to be a Joe Rogan 3-hour podcast. I don't have quite the skill to be able to pull that off, but I do want to just get you to answer briefly this question, because it's a curiosity that I have everywhere. So teacher shortage is a real thing everywhere, all across Canada. Fewer young people in particular, are going into the profession for a myriad of reasons. What are the ways in which you are trying to combat that in your recruitment process because one thing you said, you've got good people. That's because HR's figured out how to hire really good people. And what I've heard in other jurisdictions is there's a challenge because there aren't as many really good people applying for these jobs that we used to be able to turn away because we had 10 great candidates for this role. Doesn't matter. 2 or 3 of these would be great. From my understanding, that pool is not the same as it used to be. I don't know if that's true in Halifax. Maybe you guys are lucky that you're getting way, way higher level people applying. But that recruitment retention thing is an issue in Canada. How are you guys dealing with that to try to solve for that, particularly given your growth?
This is such an interesting topic, and there's so many places we could go with it. Yes, we're consistent with Canada in that there are teacher shortages. I think it's easier in Halifax than in some of the rural areas in Nova Scotia. We tend to be a bit of a magnet for teachers. And on the practical side of the table, we're doing things we haven't done before. And one example is there's a very large job fair that's hosted here for all the Nova Scotia BEd students in January. We went this year. I was there. We hired 170 people who have not yet finished their education degree. We've never done that on scale before. The biggest number I think we've hired in advance has been 30. We are changing rapidly. Government is doing a great job in terms of responding as well. They're trying a number of things. We've got an online 8-month program currently running as a pilot out of Cape Breton University. Started in January and will be done in time for students to graduate and be certified teachers for September, which is really interesting. And I'm closely connected with it because my former executive assistant decided to take the program. So she started in January and is currently student teaching in one of our schools, which is amazing. I'm hearing a lot about it and doing her coursework. So our post-secondary institutions here in Nova Scotia are changing rapidly to respond to the need for more. And we're hiring differently than we did before. When you start to talk about quality of candidates, I hesitate to say anything about that because I don't think that's fair to people who are starting out. And I think it's one of those things that people throw around that may not be that true. But here's what I think about it. And this is a broader topic, but I think education in Nova Scotia, certainly, specifically, and maybe Canada in general, we've had the benefit of relying on people volunteering their time. And that is changing because the workforce is changing, and people are saying you should pay me for my time. I think it's important to acknowledge that change is here, and I think there's opportunity in it. So go back to the idea that we weren't doing wide scale professional development because we don't have subs. So one of the many ways that we tried to do this was we'd offer after hours sessions and summer sessions, all volunteer, and we would get some folks turning out for them.
Sure.
But it seems fundamentally not, it just is not right in my mind that we would ask people to volunteer their time. I think we need to go to a place where we pay people, and specifically our teachers, differently. So one of the things I'm exploring with our partners in the NSTU is the idea that we would offer, I keep calling it HRCE's Teachers College. And that's a gross overstatement of it. But essentially, ask our teachers to come in, volunteer, but come in on Saturdays for X number of Saturdays and pay them the substitute rate. I think, well, so what does that do? It honors people for their time. It creates an expectation on our part. We're paying you. We need X, Y, and Z from you. But it also says it solves the problem you just raised about, oh, we're not getting the best anymore. Our classrooms are more complicated than they've ever been. And we're expecting a great deal as an organization. And our instructional leaders are very specific in what they're asking for. I think it's incumbent on us as the HRCE to train our teachers, to help them get to the level they need to be to meet the expectations of school leaders. And so I'm less worried about not getting the best, although I'm not sure that's true, and more focused on how do we take our folks that we have today and make them superstars,
Yeah.
and do it in a way that pays them for their time, that doesn't expect them to do more than they're already doing in a profession, which is, it's profoundly draining. It's profoundly important. It's life-changing. A teacher having a good day is something to behold, but it's also all encompassing. And it's hard to ask people to do more in this moment when they're doing so much. And let's ask them, but let's pay them for it.
If it were possible for me to transport you to Saskatchewan at the moment and get you to speak with the Saskatchewan Teachers Unit, you would be a hero with them, because you've just described so many of the issues that here in our province right now, the teachers are on work to rule and striking occasionally, trying to solve for some of the things that you've described. And I think what you touched on, Steve, is the fact that we just have to acknowledge some of the changes in society and think differently.
Yeah.
And we have been very blessed as a profession to have the teachers who have volunteered. I remember when I was on we had a local union board, and I was on the bargaining committee for the teacher side. And at that time, I'm going back now 25 years, there was no compensation for any extracurricular work. So these coaches,
Right.
these drama teachers, these people were putting in crazy amounts of time, and not just like a pat on the back saying, "Boy, it's really nice of you." And I mean, yeah, they love to do it for sure. But again, I think like it's not the same world. And I think part of the reason that people aren't choosing our profession is because of those things. They are more interested in their mental health, their well-being, and they're recognizing, I can't give this amount of
Mhm.
time just because we have teachers now that are in the midst of that kind of struggle internally around, I can't go on this way because of, as you said before, the complexity of the classroom has increased and those demands are there. And again, a myriad of issues. But anyway, I just wanted to say, I'm going to take this clip and then when I'm done and share it wildly, because I think you just addressed so many things. But listen, we're at 40 minutes, which is, that's
Great.
okay.
Well,
You
let's just stay here
add
for
one
a
more
second,
piece,
though,
add one
because
more piece.
I think it's important to say that there are lots of folks in the NSTU and employees here who would challenge what I just said. And the other side of it is that we are, as leaders in education, we're stewards of the taxpayers' fund, which is a limited resource. And it's one thing for me to come up with these ideas, but it's quite another for us to figure out how to make it work. But I believe we're facing a reckoning in terms of education. And you're exactly right in that when I started, I did everything. My first year was an 80% contract and I worked 100%. And it never occurred to me that that I should have been paid that 20%. But that's how
Yeah,
the profession was. If you go back to the 80s and the 90s, and the work is harder today than it was when I started. And
I
I think
agree.
it requires more from our teachers, and our workforce is different. And so I think it's behooves all of us as education leaders right across this country to be thinking about different ways of doing things.
That's
and exploring all of those ideas. One of the interesting things, Elwin said this to me, my predecessor here, after 5 years of sitting in the desk next to this one, he said, just wait. It feels different when you're in this desk. And I had this sort of sense of, no, it doesn't. I was the last person in every room with you for 5 years. I know what goes on. It feels very different when you sit here and you make the decision and the safety net is pulled out from under you. So as you explore these ideas, you have to resist the shiny ball phenomenon and try to see what those unforeseen, unintended consequences of your decisions are. And decision paralysis is a real thing in leadership, and it's profound in educational leadership in my mind. So I
no,
don't know if what I said was a good thing or not. Is what I'm trying to get to.
no.
I'm just we're
Listen,
exploring an idea.
yeah, yeah. And there's leaders who are so guarded and they don't want to suggest anything because they're afraid someone will twist their words around. But you've just acknowledged it. Listen, we have to acknowledge this is an issue. I don't know what the problem is. Just here's some ideas. Maybe this isn't the right
Yes,
idea, but to ignore it because you're afraid of, like you said, we have limited funds, but I'm not opposed to exploring something if it's gonna be better. No, that's fantastic. All right, couple questions. One more question, and then we'll do some rapid fire. I
sure.
always like people to show their gratitude. So you get to name one person in education that you're grateful for. It could be a coworker, a mentor, maybe an unsung hero, somebody that I love that you pointed out that your people doing the business operations might be the unsung heroes of the region. They don't see them. So I love that concept. But now I want you to get granular and name one person that you're grateful for today. I
What
know it's
kind of
hard.
question is that, Deed?
I know it's hard. Everybody hates this one because it's not
Yeah.
gonna forget this person, but just one. And then they could be able to hear this and feel like, hey, Steve gave me a little shout out. I feel good about that.
I have had the privilege of incredible mentors, and no leader got to a position of leadership on their own. It is always about the people that helped you along the way. It's oh God, like asking for one person. It I just have had incredible mentors. Ultimately, I guess I'll cheat and say my father, who was a school principal and was a principal for 20 years, and I feel as though I've been chasing his shadow for a long time, and his advice on a regular basis to me still resonates. And although now today, what he says to me when I ask him something, he says, I don't know, you'll figure it out. I'm glad he didn't say that way back when. My first job as a vice principal, pardon me, was an Oxford school in downtown Halifax. My father, that was his last job, was principal at that school. And he was a student there, taught there, was the VP there, and then ended his career as the principal. And 5 years later, I wandered in as a fresh faced VP, and an awful lot of the staff he had hired in that school were still there. It was only 5 years. And that had a profound, I was there for 4 years, and it had a profound impact on me because I had a view of my father, but then I worked with people who worked with him. And so I was constantly hearing stories, not all good, by the way, but hearing stories. And it's the family business in a lot of ways. And I'll show you right beside the door of my office. I have this old yardstick. I don't know if the camera will pick up that.
If you hold it
Might be too
steady, it
dark.
might reflect. It's coming in now.
The story of this is that a teacher found this, my first year as VP at the school, a teacher found this in the back of their classroom, shoved in a closet. And the post-it on it is from March of 1972. And it says in angry handwriting, keep clean, to be returned to Mr. T. Gallagher. That's my father. And so they gave it to me. And everywhere I've gone since, it's been hanging so I see it. And usually I see it when I walk out the door. And there are so many questions here. I was 3 years old when he stuck this on there. What kind of chemical is in this tape that it's still there, this post-it? It's really quite remarkable. Anyway, there's your cheap answer. My dad.
No, that's not cheating. That's ease in education. And again, I know you had a lot of people, but I just think it's important for us just to practice that gratitude. So I'm getting leaders to be in on that. All right. Couple of rapid fire questions, if you will,
Sure.
rapid-ish as we wrap up. What are you reading these days?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Last night, I just cracked the spine on Obama's book on his presidency, the first volume. There's two volumes. I got a chapter into that last night. Very compelling. Right now, I'm reading a book on digital citizenship here at the office. And prior to that, just finished a new book that was published in the summer on the metaverse, trying hard to get a handle on what technology is going to do to education on both sides of the table, on the business unit side and on the learning side. So I try to carve out a little time every day to read, usually at lunch, maybe 20 minutes of a workbook. So how's that for an answer?
That's good. Yeah. And I'll give you one just if you're in on that. One of the books that we've used in our kind of generative AI work is Mo Goddard's Scary Smart. So Mo Goddard was a
Oh, okay.
former Google employee behind a lot of the things. And I think what's interesting about him is that he's writing this book called Scary Smart, but at the same time, he's written a number of books on happiness. So he understands the potential. And we talked about this, I think, last time about this can
Right.
go badly quick, and it will in some ways, but he also has that other side. So I like that. So there's a recommendation. What about on the when it's after, I don't know, after Friday night hockey or Saturday, when you just want to watch something that's maybe a little bit more mindless or just to get your mind, or maybe you don't have mindless, maybe your mind's going all the time, but always curious to know if people have any kind of
No, I have
guilty
mindless.
pleasures that they like,
Yeah, you know what? I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I'm a bit of a sucker for YouTube. A couple years ago, I stopped really watching movies and TV
right?
series, and I love Throttle House on YouTube. If
What's
you're a
that?
bit of a car guy, that's the place to go. A couple of Canadians just hitting it out of the park. They're very big on YouTube. Similar to a modern Canadian version of Top Gear, which of course was a very famous TV show about cars for many years. Podcasts. I love Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend, Fly on the Wall. That's a great one. Yeah, there's a bunch that I
So with podcasts, where are you consuming these? Is this like commutes, walks, runs, housework? I don't know.
you know what? Mostly like housework, absolutely.
Yeah.
And also on the drive. The drive to
Okay.
work is prime time for that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Lately, I've fallen down the rabbit hole of former history teacher, the JFK assassination podcasts. And
Oh, no.
there's, yeah, Rob Reiner and Soledad O'Brien had one that came out in October. It's just November was his 60th anniversary, and high quality and legitimate people. So that kind of got me going on it again. And so there's, to your point, there's no shortage out there, and it's a very compelling topic.
Oh, cool. And finally, last question. What would be a lesser known hidden gem place or space to explore in your region for visitors? Things that might not make the top Google search of Halifax tourism, but like just a hidden gem. It could be a restaurant, it could be an area, it could be whatever. What's a hidden gem
Yeah.
people should know
Mm.
about?
There's Nova Scotia. There's everywhere you go is a gem. And I guess from a provincial perspective, I would say you're never further than an hour away from the ocean anywhere in Nova Scotia. So getting to the coast is all you need to do, and you'll feel better. Halifax has got an incredible, vibrant art scene, restaurants, nightlife, all of that stuff. But there are some great places. Everybody knows about Peggy's Cove, but there's also lots of other spots that are as beautiful. And if you get out to York Redoubt out at the mouth of the harbor here in Halifax, the views of the ocean are spectacular. There's a little look off just beyond it where we get some pretty amazing swells, and only the locals know about it. So it's rarely ever crowded. So that's a fantastic place. If you can get to the North Shore of Nova Scotia, your life is better for it. Everybody talks about Cape Breton or the South Shore, but the North Shore is amazing. Absolutely amazing.
Steve, this was a fascinating conversation and one that I felt bad that I had to cut short because there were so many gems in here. We may have to set up a part two for this, but so appreciate getting to know you. And I'm so impressed with the work that you guys are doing and your thoughtfulness around leadership. So thank you for your time today, Steve.
Thank you. Appreciated the conversation.